Let's return to China, as you think it is the central target for the tariffs. The Chinese government has already announced that it will retaliate against the U.S., raising tariffs by 34% on all U.S. goods and restricting the export of rare earths. Could there be further retaliations?
Well, right now, all eyes are on China. As you said, they've already retaliated, albeit limitedly, and Trump will respond. So this could be the beginning of a new U.S.-China trade war with far-reaching effects beyond what happened in Trump's first term. It could also be the fact that they were restrained in their response could indicate that there may be a new U.S.-China trade deal, maybe enforcing the trade one and making the phase one deal from his first term and making a phase two. So let's look at China in detail. So on top of the first term tariffs that Trump imposed, that's about 13%. Then he announced 20% earlier this year on the national emergency for fentanyl production. And then the 34% tariff that he imposed, the so-called reciprocal tariff, that brings China's tariff level up to approximately 67%. So this is actually more than the 60% Trump promised during his campaign. In addition, Trump finally scrapped the de minimis rule, which had been delayed since February. So now Chinese e-commerce exporters like Temu and Shein will have their business models upended. From a wider perspective of Chinese transshipment, which I mentioned before, these across-the-board tariffs, they make some sense. The problem is seeing all the nations in the world that have a trade surplus with the U.S. as the same as China, since China is the only one that's actually a U.S. near-peer competitor. Since most Americans are not really aware of the structure of the global economy, to them maybe all deficits seem equal. But this is just simply not true. What is more important to me is if a country is a net deficit or a net surplus country globally, regardless of its trade balance with the U.S. So all countries with net deficits would be ideal partners in addressing the challenge of Chinese overcapacity, if this is truly what Trump is trying to do. So this is one of the main reasons why the Trump approach, if it's intended to go after China first, doesn't completely make sense. At the very least, it will lead to suboptimal outcomes unless deals are cut very quickly. Simply put, Trump seems to think trade balances bilaterally and not across the global trading system as a whole. So this bilateral approach only makes sense. It's only coherent if it's to facilitate negotiations, not actually solve the problem of these global economic distortions caused by China's growth model. Furthermore, key allies, even if they have trade deficits with the U.S., they should be judged not just on their absolute deficit or the presence of a deficit, but how much it's increasing, much less the size of their economies. So overall, net deficit countries and U.S. allies could realign to rebalance global trade and collectively manage the China challenge. But in Trump's views, this might not necessarily be America first, or at least not America first enough. I mean, even though I think it would be in the U.S. national interest. And strategically speaking, I think such an approach would build trust with allies, and it would be less risky, especially if the intention is to arrange U.S. trading partners into a new U.S.-led economic order. Now in Europe, right, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then China's support for Russia, you had seen signs during the Biden administration that they were becoming conscious of China's challenge to their economy too, and citing towards the U.S. in terms of the whole de-risking strategy. And with its current economic issues, even Germany could have been a U.S. partner, despite its trade surplus with the U.S. But since Trump just sees trade bilaterally rather than systemically, I mean, this is just how he sees the world. He risks alienating the partners he would need to produce the global economic effects he claims he wants. So instead, again, I think Trump should identify which countries have a large and persistent surplus with all the U.S. trading partners like China, to a lesser extent the EU, not just a bilateral surplus with the U.S. And when you look at how the tariffs were calculated, it's clear that that's the main, or the only factor. So, for instance, Japan, the UK, Canada, and Mexico, yeah, they all have trade surpluses with the U.S., but they have overall trade deficits in the world economy. And so they're absorbing, by net, they're absorbing global imbalances. They're like the U.S., but with smaller markets from a global standpoint. So they should be ideal partners, not tariff targets. That's my opinion. Now, as I mentioned before, Trump's first-term tariffs on China didn't work as expected because producers, both Chinese and others, rerouted goods from Southeast Asia or Mexico. They rerouted goods through Southeast Asia or Mexico. This led to accelerating U.S. deficits with these countries as well. So China wants to keep its access to the U.S. market. That's clear, both directly or through transshipment. as exports are the only real solution to its own internal economic imbalances besides increased consumption, which will be difficult to stimulate. So since domestic consumption and exports to the US will no longer be sufficient to hit that 5% growth target, I wonder if the tariffs will force China to increase domestic investment in a way that subsidizes manufacturing even more, which could create, despite the tariffs, could create an even stronger manufacturing sector and greater exports to the world. So that's going to become a global problem. The real question, though, is China willing to repeat what they did when faced with Trump's first-term tariffs? This is the big mystery. Will they devalue the renminbi? There's plenty of room for China to devalue its currency. Financial analysts noted earlier this year that China has held back in doing so in response to the 20% tariffs imposed in February and then put on in March. But China's trade surplus is larger than ever. And the RMB is significantly undervalued. So that makes it difficult to devalue. So not to mention that devaluation would trigger significant global risk. As the last time China devalued was in response to US tariffs. This is in the Trump's first term. The emerging market currencies experienced a huge sell-off, which ultimately impacted the entire economy. So if China devalues the RMB, that's a sign that they have lost hope in making any deal, and that it's going to go full-on trade war. So alternatively, though, as long as China hasn't devalued and they keep up the same sort of proportional response, putting 34% tariffs in exchange for, or in response to Trump's 34% new tariffs, then China could offer RMB appreciation as an exchange for getting the tariffs reduced, since that seems to be one of Trump's goals. But again, this is a slim possibility. It's totally speculative. Now, if it happened, it would be in the U.S. interest. But with China escalating its response, I don't know. It appears that devaluation is more likely than a negotiated appreciation of the renminbi. Now, that being said, China probably doesn't want to devalue, since RMB instability is counterproductive to its own financial goals. It would decrease its credibility in making the RMB a rival reserve currency for international transactions within its BRICS bloc, which it's tried to do ever since the U.S. put incredible sanctions on Russia, forced it out of the global trading system, forced it out of using SWIFT for international transactions, and even froze its access to U.S. treasuries. And now, in a perfect world for China, they would want to facilitate this emerging BRICS bloc as a counterweight to America's unpredictability and Trump's attempt to tariff the whole world. So the perfect world for them is all U.S. trading partners retaliate against Trump. That causes Trump to back down because the markets tank, as they're going to do. This is almost right before Monday morning in the U.S. So markets tank, cause Trump to back down, and then this rescues China before their economy is further damaged or they're forced to actually take wild steps like devaluing. So maybe China can portray itself to the world in contrast to Trump as this beacon of stability, the defender of free trade, improving relations with Europe or even Canada. In terms of trade, however, I'm not sure that there's any other market in the world that can help absorb Chinese goods. If I'm not mistaken, at least before these tariffs, around 15% of China's exports, I think, are exported to the U.S. So others are, again, like I said, they go through transshipment. So the number might be a bit higher. So, think about it from the EU standpoint. They're also worried that Chinese exports to the US will be redirected towards them because it seems like the only market that is comparable to absorb it. So there's reports that the EU is now thinking about how to put up their own tariffs to prevent this. And other countries around the world are probably thinking the same thing. So now, that's the best case for China is if Trump backs down. But the worst case is if these tariffs actually create an incentive for U.S. trading partners to cut deals as quickly as they can before their competitors and are forced into taking some degree of anti-China measures to get these U.S. tariffs removed or at least decreased. So I was thinking earlier, Obama was right that the U.S. needed to create these trade zones like TPP and TTIP for the Atlantic. That would align its allies and partners in a way that supported U.S. interests. In other words, an economic anchor for its security policy. Now, Trump abandoned these deals because he hates multilateral free trade agreements, and he prefers bilateral negotiations and bilateral arrangements that give the U.S. more leverage. Now, I just wonder, thinking back to 10 years ago, I wonder if Trump will try to grant most favored nation status on a bilateral and case-by-case basis to create these kinds of TPP and TTIP trade zones, but in a bilateral, different way. In his first term, he was unable to rally U.S. trading partners by tariffing China alone, but maybe this time by tariffing the whole world, there'll be more leverage. China would not like this outcome, but again, it's a major gamble. It's a major gamble with plenty of risks, but with high risk comes high reward. So back to China, to sum it up, they have options. One is to back down and concede to Trump, which is, I don't know, I think that's unlikely given its initial retaliatory response, but they could still be thinking about it. Another is to unleash trillions of dollars in fiscal stimulus that will likely go into investment and lead to surging debt in order to make sure that its industries can ride out the impact of these tariffs. Now, based on these projections, I think that if China decides to go down this confrontational road, I think more than this huge stimulus, I think maybe RMB devaluation by at least 20% could become a more likely possibility. Now, I don't know. It's dangerous to even think about it because this would have severe global economic implications.
関税がもしアメリカがですねワークしていると世論が受け取ってしまうと、我々としてはやはりその見栄養のもというか、やはりグローバルな自由貿易良かったなということになりかねないというかですね。